Tibet and China have mostly been independent. Of course, there is this claim that that the Mongol king at some point did rule over Tibet as well as China. But otherwise, other than that, they have been, and that is basically China's claim. But apart from that, they have been independent nations. In fact, if you look at Tibet, Tibet shares a lot of cultural history with India. We are spiritually connected in that angle. Now, Tibet was also, it's 2,500 miles of border that we currently share with China was actually what we shared with Tibet. And it acted like a buffer state between India and China. The British were smart because, see, whatever the British did in India, but for them, the territory was important and they wanted to protect it. So they had several talks with China right from 1800, late 1800s to early 1900s. And throughout the discussion was that nobody will rule over Tibet. Tibet will remain an independent country, and both China and Britain will try to ensure that it happens that way. Nevertheless, at one point in 1950, China started moving towards Tibet and the transgression happened. On our part, Nehru kind of allowed Tibet, a peaceful neighbor and buffer between us and China, to be erased as a nation, even without recording a protest in UN. What is even more shameful is that there was a point Nehru did say that there's very little we can do. We cannot militarily fight with China. But that kind of is in contradiction with what actually happened in the Indochina War. Nevertheless, we could have done some things diplomatically. And what happened was the Tibetan government actually protested to the UN against the Chinese aggression. And Tibet was not a member of UN. So such kind of protests were treated as appeals by NGO. In view of this handicap, Tibetans actually requested government of India to raise this issue at UN. We did not. We did not even raise this issue at UN and put it in contrast with us raising the issue of Kashmir in UN ourselves. So where a nation is being erased, we don't raise it in UN, but where a part of our country is disputed, we raise it in UN. This was sort of like a contradiction. Anyways, we shamelessly advised Tibet to actually seek a peaceful settlement with China. Not only that, even worse, when through others, Tibet's appeal came up on 23rd November 1950 for discussions in the UN General Assembly. We opposed the discussions on a very flimsy ground that India had received a note from China that matter would be resolved peacefully. Dr. Rajendra Prasad had something very profound to say about it, and I would like to quote him. I hope I am not seeing ghosts and phantoms, but I see the murder of Tibet recoiling on India. He had also written, in the matter of Tibet, we acted unchivalrously, but even against our interest in not maintaining the position of a buffer state for it, had thus exposed the frontier of 2,500 miles to the Chinese. I have very strong feelings about it. I feel that blood of Tibet is on us. But the Prime Minister does not like the name of Tibet to be mentioned even now and regards any mention of its liberation as manifest nonsense. I think at some point Nehru did think, it's not a documented fact, but it was always an idea that he was generally okay with China taking over Tibet because of his communist leanings, though none of it is corroborated. Thereafter, the next thing happened. So Tibet as a nation got erased and India did nothing about it. And then came the death knell, which was Panchsheel. Panchsheel was almost like selling Tibet and harming yourself. So the Panchsheel Agreement is actually titled as Agreement on Trade and Intercourse between the Tibet region of in China and India. So when it says Tibet region of China and you sign such a trade agreement, it essentially means we have accepted that Tibet is a region in China. And India actually never really gained anything through the agreement. All the benefits were accrued to China. Sounds a little bit like Belt and Road Initiative, where all the benefits are on one party, and the other party simply has to do something, simply has to invest or let go of some things. S.K. Verma in 1962, The War That Wasn't, he wrote, the Panchsheel Agreement signed between India and China reflected Nehru's idealism that was far removed from the world of real politics. At that stage, India had at least held some cards. The most important, perhaps, being the physical access to Lhasa. Nehru chose to discard them without getting in return any concession from the Chinese in Tibet. Not only that, Government of India then began to hide from its own people the Chinese transgressions on the border. Speaking of border, I'd like to mention one thing. India and China, the border was the McMahon Line, and McMahon Line was simply drawn by a British officer without putting much attention to the terrain around there. And in fact, China, several times in 1950, in 1954, in 1960, they had talked about it. They said we should settle borders. In fact, in 1960, Zhou Enlai had settled the borders with Nepal and Burma, and they had also come to India. And Nehru just refused to discuss the point. He was adamant on the fact that it is the McMahon Line, which is the India China border. There is nothing to discuss. But now hold it in contrast with what happened in Tibet. Now, on that side, you actually saw the transgression happening into Tibet, an entire nation being swallowed. And the fact that you starting to have a 2,500-mile border with China now. How do you not think of settling the borders? And if you are going to sell Tibet and sign Panchil, the least you could have done is ask for the border to be settled and taken some concessions there. But it was not done. Nevertheless, Walter Crocker in Nehru, a contemporary's estimate, wrote, India step by step renounced the hard-won special position in Tibet, which Britain had bequeathed to her. And she accepted Chinese suzerainty in principle and Chinese sovereignty in fact. Nehru dismissed the notion of Tibet as a buffer state, a buffer between whom, and described India's previous special position there as an outmoded relic of imperialism. India's renunciation was sealed in series of Sino-Indian agreements, the most important being the Agreement on Trade and signed in 1954, which is called as Panchsheel. So not only did we not settle our borders, we signed the Panchsheel, which was a death knell for Tibet. It was an official acceptance that, yeah, now Tibet is part of China. Thereafter, something interesting happens, but I'll first go through some quotations. So Acharya Kriplani also had something to say. He said, this great doctrine, which is Panchsheel, was born in sin because it was enunciated to put the seal of our approval upon the destruction of an ancient nation which was associated with us spiritually and culturally. It was a nation which wanted to live its own life and it sought to have been allowed to live its own life. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar also spoke about it. He said the Prime Minister has practically helped the Chinese to bring their border down to the Indian border. Looking at all these signs, it seems to me that it would be an act of levity not to believe that India, if it is not exposed to aggression right now, is exposed to aggression. Exactly the point that I was making. You lose the 2,500 border with Tibet, which is basically your buffer area. They would have to cross over from Tibet to actually reach your borders, and now you've opened it up for the Chinese. But what happens after this is even more contradictory. So now here we are talking about India playing it safe with China. India saying, we don't want to go to war with China. We don't want to fight for Tibet. We don't even want to raise our voice in UN lest we offend China. But at the same time, something weird happened, and I think this is only my assessment. I think it also happened because during this time after Panchsheel was signed, and you must have seen so many people actually spoke about it. In fact, there was an organization formed which spoke about Tibet in India. And I think Nehru was under pressure to show that he was not soft on China. But, when you're passive and you want to become assertive, sometimes people become aggressive. which is a weird thing. You become aggressive and then assertive. And something like that happened on the India China war.